You are lying in bed right now, phone lit up an inch from your face, thumb moving down a list of 300 names. You know almost none of them will call you back tonight. You keep scrolling anyway. Nobody taught you to do this. You just do it. In 2003, a psychologist named Naomi Eisenberger put people inside an fMRI scanner at UCLA and had them play a simple ball-tossing game with 2 other players. The game was rigged. At some point, the other 2 players stopped throwing the ball to the person in the scanner and left them out for the rest of the round. The brain scan lit up in the anterior cingulate cortex. That is the same region that fires when your hand touches a hot stove. Being left out registered as physical pain, not a metaphor for pain. Pain. Eisenberger's study has since been repeated in variations across more than a dozen labs, with the same region lighting up whether the exclusion came from strangers in a lab from a former partner or, in one 2011 follow-up, from a person's own recorded voicemail messages describing a recent breakup. The location changes. The circuitry does not. You assume loneliness is something new, a side effect of apartments, screens, and cities full of strangers who never learn your name. That assumption is wrong, and the wrongness is the entire reason this feeling won't leave you alone. Ancient humans did not invent group living for comfort. They invented it because a human alone on the open savanna 200,000 years ago was dead within days. No claws, no fangs, no fur thick enough for a cold night. A solitary human was a slow, soft, edible thing. Survival required exactly one strategy: stay inside the group at almost any cost. That is where the ache started. Robin Dunbar, an anthropologist at Oxford, spent years studying primate brain size against group size and arrived at a number that still holds up across hunter-gatherer societies today, roughly 150. That is the upper limit of relationships a human brain can track with any real depth. Below that number, cooperation runs on trust. Above it, it collapses into strangers. Dunbar did not pull the number from a survey. He built it from a correlation he found across dozens of primate species, comparing the size of the neocortex, the part of the brain handling complex thought, against the largest stable social group each species maintained in the wild. Chimpanzees, with smaller neocortices than humans, top out around 50. Humans with a proportionally larger neocortex top out around 150. The number shows up again and again outside the lab. Traditional hunter-gatherer bands cluster around it. Historical military companies were often organized around it. Even now, companies that try to keep informal, trust-based cultures instead of layers of bureaucracy tend to hit friction right around the same headcount. That is not a coincidence born of modern management theory. That is a hard ceiling your ancestors' brains built long before anyone had a company to run. But that assumption was completely wrong. You do not feel lonely because modern life removed community. You feel lonely because your brain still runs software built for constant proximity to about 150 people, and most of you now live your entire adult life inside a group of 4. Scientists have a term for what fires when that number drops too low. They call it the exile response. The exile response is not sadness. Sadness tells you something is gone. The exile response tells your body something is coming. Cortisol rises, blood pressure climbs. Sleep gets shallow and interrupted, the same way it would if a predator were somewhere nearby in the dark. Your body is not grieving a missing friend group. It is preparing for an attack that, for 200,000 years, reliably followed isolation. Primatologist Frans de Waal, who spent much of his career at Emory University observing chimpanzee and bonobo troops, documented a behavior he called reconciliation. After a fight within the group, the 2 animals involved would often seek each other out within minutes, touching, grooming, or embracing, well before any practical need to cooperate had returned. The reconciliation was not strategic. It happened too fast for calculation, and it happened even between animals with no immediate task requiring teamwork. De Waal's observation matters because grooming in primates generally does more than clean fur. It triggers the release of oxytocin, a hormone that lowers cortisol and produces a calm, safe feeling in the animal being groomed. A troop that grooms often is a troop with its exile response held quietly in check, moment by moment, hand over skin. Humans lost most of our body hair somewhere along the evolutionary road, but the behavior survived in stranger forms. A hand on a shoulder, an arm around someone crying. A hug held 2 seconds longer than necessary. You did not learn these gestures from a manual. You inherited the machinery from ancestors who used touch daily to tell each other's nervous systems that the exile response could stand down for a while. This is the part nobody talks about. The exile response did not evolve to make you feel bad for its own sake. It evolved as an alarm, a smoke detector for social death. And like every alarm built by evolution instead of an engineer, it cannot tell the difference between an actual threat and an unread text message. Stephen Churchill, a paleoanthropologist at Duke University, has spent decades studying a set of Neanderthal remains found at Shanidar Cave in northern Iraq, first excavated in the 1950s and re-examined with modern techniques starting in 2014. One skeleton, known as Shanidar 1, belonged to a man who was blind in one eye, missing part of an arm, and likely deaf, injuries that would have made him useless for hunting for years before he died. He lived to roughly 40, ancient for his time in species. Shanidar 1 was first excavated by Ralph Selecki in 1957 and remains one of the most cited Neanderthal skeletons ever found, precisely because his injuries were catalogued in such detail: the withered right arm amputated below the elbow, the crushing damage to the left eye socket, the bone loss consistent with long-term deafness. A body that broken in an environment that unforgiving does not survive on its own for a single season, let alone for years. Someone fed him, someone protected him, for years. That is not an accident. A group does not carry a member who contributes nothing unless the cost of losing him, as a person, as a bond, as a thread in the group's survival web, outweighed the cost of feeding him. Neanderthals were doing the math on connection 50,000 years before anyone wrote the word loyalty down. The exile response is why that math got made in the first place. A group without it would have made the colder calculation instead: cut the injured man loose, save the food, move faster across the land. Groups that felt nothing when a member was pushed out would have shed their weakest members constantly and lost the accumulated knowledge, the extra hands, the sheer numbers that let a tribe survive a bad winter or a hungry animal at the edge of camp. Groups that felt the exile response and worked to avoid triggering it in others held together longer, and groups that held together longer out-survived the ones that didn't. This is not sentiment dressed up as science. It is arithmetic that ran for 200,000 years, one buried skeleton at a time, until only the descendants of the tribes that clung to each other were left to write any of this down. Here is where the surface answer starts to crack. If ancient humans lived in constant physical company, wrapped in a group of 150 relatives and allies, you would expect them to be immune to loneliness. Full days of company. Fires shared every night. No apartments, no distance, no scrolling. The obvious conclusion is that loneliness is something civilization built, brick by brick, as it pulled people apart. The evidence said something else entirely. Kipling Williams, a social psychologist at Purdue University, spent over 20 years studying ostracism, the act of being excluded rather than simply being alone. His research, replicated across more than 5,000 participants in different countries, found something specific. People report the exile response even when they consciously know the exclusion is meaningless. In one version of his experiment, participants were told the other players were computer programs, not real people. They still felt it. You can know with total certainty that being excluded costs you nothing. Your body will not listen. This is where the false comfort of ancient life falls apart. Physical proximity was never the thing keeping the exile response quiet. Belonging was. And belonging, even inside a group of 150 people who slept 20 feet away from you, could be revoked. Among the Julianne San of the Kalahari, studied extensively by anthropologist Richard Lee starting in the 1960s, the harshest available punishment for serious wrongdoing was not violence. It was banishment. A person could be told plainly to leave the group and survive alone. In an environment with no other groups nearby for hundreds of miles, this was, functionally, a death sentence delivered without a single blow. Loneliness was not the absence of people. It was the absence of a place among them. Richard Lee's fieldwork among the Julianne in the 1960s recorded something else worth sitting with. Within these bands of 25 to 50 people, gossip functioned as a constant low-grade audit of everyone's standing. Who shared meat fairly? Who pulled their weight on a hunt? Who could be trusted to watch a child? A person's position in the group was not fixed once and left alone. It was renegotiated daily, in conversation, around the fire, in full view of everyone. That is exhausting to imagine, and it was, by every account, exhausting to live. But it also meant a person always knew, with reasonable precision, exactly where they stood. There was no ambiguity to lie awake wondering about. Either the group still counted you in, and you could feel it in 100 small daily signals, or you had already been told to leave. Christopher Boehm, an anthropologist at the University of Southern California, spent decades comparing punishment systems across 24 documented hunter-gatherer societies and found a near-universal pattern. The most severe available punishment, used more often than execution, was some form of expulsion from the group. Not prison, not fines. Removal from the circle of people who counted you as one of their own. That detail matters more than it looks like it does at first glance. A society built almost entirely on cooperations does not need cages. It only needs one threat serious enough to keep almost everyone in line, the threat of no longer belonging. No one had checked for this before Bohm laid the pattern side by side across cultures with no contact with one another. Societies on different continents, with no shared history, independently arrived at the same weapon, exile. That is not culture. That is biology finding the same lock and the same key twice. Sarah Blaffer-Hrdy, an anthropologist at UC Davis, has argued that human infants survive their unusually long, helpless childhoods only because they were raised by more than just a mother, a practice she calls alloparenting, where aunts, grandmothers, and unrelated group members all shared the work of keeping a child alive. A human baby left with only one caregiver and no backup network had dramatically worse odds. The exile response, in other words, did not start in adulthood. It started in the crib, wired in before a child could speak. That's not a metaphor. That's natural selection. Every human alive today is descended, without exception, from ancestors who were terrified of being cut off from the group because the ones who weren't terrified enough didn't survive to have children. You did not choose to feel a small jolt of dread when a message goes unanswered for 3 days. You inherited it from every person in your bloodline who felt that exact jolt and used it to go patch things up before it was too late. Harry Harlow, a psychologist at the University of Wisconsin, ran a set of experiments in the late 1950s that would never be approved today, isolating young rhesus monkeys from contact with other monkeys for periods ranging from several days to several months. The isolated monkeys did not simply grow up sad. Many showed permanent behavioral damage, rocking, self-clasping, an inability to interact normally with other monkeys even years later, once they were finally returned to a group. Isolation did not just feel bad to them, it rewired what came after it. Human children show a version of the same pattern. Studies of children raised in severely understaffed Romanian orphanages after 1989, tracked for years afterward by researchers including Charles Nelson at Harvard, found measurable differences in brain development in children who experienced prolonged social neglect in infancy, compared to children placed in family care early. The exile response is not a mood. In a developing brain, it is a construction crew, and it builds with whatever material it is given. There is an obvious objection here, and it deserves a straight answer instead of a shrug. Not every human in isolation falls apart. In 1704, a Scottish sailor named Alexander Selkirk was marooned alone on an uninhabited island off the coast of Chile after a dispute with his ship's captain. He survived completely alone for 4 years and 4 months before being rescued in 1709. He did not die of loneliness. He built shelters, hunted goats, and kept himself alive through sheer will. But he did not come back unchanged. Accounts from his rescuers describe a man who had partly lost the habit of speech, who reverted to more primitive routines, and who spent years afterwards struggling to readjust to company he had once taken for granted. Selkirk proves the exile response is survivable. He does not disprove that it exacts a cost. His body ran the same ancient alarm as anyone else's. He simply had no choice but to endure it for 4 straight years, with no way to answer it. That is the exception that confirms the rule, not the one that breaks it. Selkirk's case is often retold as a story about resilience. It is really a story about the price of running the exile response for 4 straight years with no way to shut it off. He kept himself alive through skill and stubbornness. He came home changed in ways his own rescuers noted immediately, in journal entries written within days of finding him, describing a man who spoke haltingly and startled easily around other people. The alarm did not turn off just because there was no fire circle left to check. It kept running, unanswered, for 51 months. An alarm with no one left to warn does not go quiet. It just runs longer, and it runs alone. The unexpected angle is this: the exile response was never actually about being physically alone. It was about status inside the group, about whether you still counted. A hunter-gatherer surrounded by 150 people who quietly stopped including him in decisions would have registered the exact same alarm as a man alone on an island. Proximity was never the variable, standing was. Julianne Holt-Lunstad, a researcher at Brigham Young University, ran a meta-analysis in 2015 covering more than 3 million people across multiple countries, and found that chronic loneliness carries a mortality risk comparable to smoking roughly 15 cigarettes a day, worse than the health risk from obesity, and worse than the risk from physical inactivity. 15 cigarettes a day, for something that leaves no smoke and no smell. No one had checked for this before her work, not with numbers that large. The finding did not describe a modern mental health trend. It described an ancient survival mechanism, still fully armed, now firing constantly in a world that no longer needs it. Because the modern world removed almost every visible cue the exile response was built to detect. You do not sit around a single fire with the same 150 faces anymore. You do not know if you are included or excluded in most of the groups your life technically belongs to, a workplace, a hometown, a distant extended family, because you rarely see them at all. The alarm has no clear signal to read anymore, so it runs low and constant, a hum instead of a spike, and you call that hum just how life feels now. The Cigna Corporation's loneliness survey of over 20,000 American adults, first conducted in 2018 and repeated in 2020, found that nearly 3 in 5 adults reported feeling lonely on a regular basis, and the number was highest, not lowest, among people in their 20s, the most digitally connected generation that has ever existed. More contact than any generation in history, more loneliness reported than almost any generation on record. This is not a coincidence, and it is not a paradox once you understand what the exile response was actually built to measure. It was never built to count messages. It was built to measure whether you had a stable, known place inside a group small enough to matter. A place where your absence would be noticed and your return expected. A phone can deliver 1,000 messages and never once deliver that. John Cacioppo, who spent much of his career at the University of Chicago, running what became known as the Chicago Health, Aging, and Social Relations Study, tracked hundreds of adults over years and found that loneliness did not simply correlate with poor health. It predicted it. Lonely participants showed elevated inflammatory markers, worse sleep architecture, and higher blood pressure years before any diagnosis appeared. The exile response, running quietly in the body, treating a modern absence of belonging as an ancient physical threat. The body cannot read a calendar, it only reads signals. And the signals a hunter-gatherer's body was built to read. A face at the fire, a hand on the shoulder, a place held open at mealtime, mostly do not exist anymore. Replaced by signals, the exile response was never designed to interpret at all. They had no concept of a notification. They had no concept of being seen by 300 people and known by none of them. They simply lived inside a fire circle small enough that everyone's face meant something, and if that face went missing for a day, someone asked why. We turned that into a blue check mark and called it progress. The false comfort dies here, in the space between what ancient life looked like and what it actually delivered. It was not warm because people were nearby. It was warm because nearness came with a guarantee, a place, checked and rechecked every single day, that could not be quietly lost inside a crowd of strangers who never learn your name.